Our scripture this evening comes from Daniel chapter 6, verses 3 through 5. Then this Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit, and the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. Then the commissioners and satraps began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to government affairs, but they could find no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful, and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. Then these men said, "We will not find any ground of accusation against this Daniel, unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God."
You know, being accused of something when you are totally innocent of any wrongdoing is something that's really kind of hard to take. It's kind of hard to endure. No one likes to be unfairly treated. No one likes to be unfairly accused of things that they didn't do. And it had to feel that way for Daniel in Daniel chapter 6, of being accused of having done something that was not wrong. You know, Daniel did what was right, and as a result of doing what was right, he was sentenced to death like a criminal. Now, this account, of what happened to Daniel is, I think sometimes we just kind of, it's Daniel in the lion's den. It's an exciting story to tell the kids in Bible school, but it's far more than that. This account is something that has many valuable lessons from the life of this man. Daniel is an exceptional Bible character which you could literally preach on week in and week out and have different lessons based on different things that took place just in the first 6 chapters of that 12-chapter book. But he was a man who slept with lions. And so that's kind of makes him unique, that he was able to sleep in a cave full of hungry lions. And these lions would oftentimes be left to the point of starvation. In other words, they didn't get fed unless there was criminals to feed to them. And so these were not lions that, were, maybe they were hungry, maybe they weren't. They were definitely hungry, and we see that even at the end of this story. But I want us to back up, and I want us to kind of take in Daniel's background, of his life. And when we think about Daniel's background, we go all the way back to the beginning of the book, and we see Daniel as a teenager, probably in the 14-year-old range when he arrives in the nation of Babylon. He was probably of the royal family of Judah. Hezekiah was told when he showed off all the treasures of Judah to the Babylonian representatives that members of his own house would be taken into captivity by the Babylonians, and Daniel may have very well fit into that description. But he's taken into captivity under King Nebuchadnezzar. And when we think about being 13, 14 years old and being taken into captivity, I want you to hear the description that Habakkuk gives to the Babylonian people as he tells about the people that are going to conquer Judah. In Habakkuk chapter 1, in verses 5 through 11, they are described as fierce. They are described as dreaded. They are feared. It says that they are like wolves and eagles as they descend upon and consume their prey. And so we see that the descriptions that Habakkuk gives, certainly in a prophetic sense, are ones that call for dread, call for this is not a good situation. And you're 13 or 14 years old, and that's where your life, you go from a palace to a slave. And yet we see even at that young age, Daniel was a young man that was given to God. Daniel and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were subjected to forced indoctrination. And there was a lot of things that came into that. They were taught the pagan stories, the pagan mythologies of Babylon. They were put into school basically to be Babylonians. And the whole idea was to take these young men that were without defect, these young men that were exceptional, and to bring them in and turn them basically into Babylonians that would serve in the court. And so it was an indoctrination program. And so they come into that indoctrination program, and there's a lot of things that Daniel and his friends endured and were willing to endure, but there came a point where part of that program interfered with obeying God. and that is by the food that they were going to feed them. And even as a young man, even as a teenager, Daniel shows his incredible devotion to God by saying we're not going to do that. And folks, you just didn't do that. Today, we have people talk back to the government all the time, but you did not do that to men like Nebuchadnezzar and keep your life. But yet they did. And God, because of that faith that they had, He blesses them, and their diet and what they were allowed to eat caused them to be healthier than all the others that were in this indoctrination program that the Babylonians had. He was promoted. He served in the royal courts of the most powerful nations of his day. He served in the court of the Babylonians. He served in the court of the Persian Empire as well. And not only that, not only did they serve in the governmental functions, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would be the governors of the province of Babylon, where the city of Babylon was. They would actually rule that province. But Daniel would become head over all the wise men of the East. And so he held a very powerful position, a very influential position in that day and time. By the time we get to Daniel chapter 6, we see these pictures, and I think maybe my picture even has him a little too young. We see these pictures sometimes of Daniel in the lion's den, and it's this young man. He looks like he's about in his 30s. But we need to understand that when Daniel went into the lion's den, and when we go into chapter 6, Daniel is probably anywhere from 80 to 85 years old at the time that story takes place. So he has lived a long life in this world of politics, in this world of vast and heinous corruption. He has existed there now for upwards of 70 years. And yet we see that all those things around him had not had an impact on him, at least taking him away from God. By the time we see Daniel chapter 6, Daniel chapters 7 through 12 have already taken place, because running parallel with 1 through 6 are 7 through 12. He's seeing visions during the times that we see in chapters 1 through 6, the storylines that we see there at the beginning of the book. He's seeing these incredible visions that are recorded then from chapter 7 through 12. And, so Daniel has seen a lot, and he has experienced a lot when we reach Daniel chapter 6. Well, we see that there is a plot against him. Daniel is one of 3 men in the vast Persian Empire, by far the largest empire that had existed up to that point. And he was one of the 3 men that ruled. And they ruled over 120 provinces. They ruled over men that were called satraps. And they ruled over the provinces of Persia. So 120 provinces. And there were 3 men that ruled over those 120 men that ruled in those provinces, and Daniel was one of those men. And yet the king was about to make a decision to put Daniel over all of them, to give Daniel all the power that was divided up amongst those 3 men. It was going to be laid strictly upon Daniel himself, and the 2 that were with him did not like that idea. But what is amazing with Daniel is that Daniel's good and honest and godly reputation was known and proclaimed by his enemies. It's one thing to have the people that love you talk good about you. When my mother tells me you had a good sermon, I go, but you're biased. I'm your baby. You're going to say those kind of things. It's one thing when people that love you say good things. It's another thing when your enemies do. And we see in their discussions, it reminds me when I read this, it reminds me of the discussions that the Pharisees sometimes had, where they were like, we can't find anything on this guy, we're just going to have to make it up, right? Where they said, the commissioners began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to government affairs, but they could find no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. So there is your politician who's not corrupt, right? Guy in the government who's not corrupt, Daniel. And he has been there a long time, so he's had all kinds of opportunities to become corrupt. And yet he has chosen not to. And so they decide that we will not find any ground of accusation against Daniel in those kind of areas. So we're going to have to find it in regard to his God. So they understand something else about Daniel. They understand why Daniel is the way that he is. I mean, you got to pay attention to where they go with this. They go, okay, we understand he never does anything wrong. He's not corrupt. He's not doing the things that everybody else in government is doing. He is different, but we know why he's different, because of his God. And so if we're going to get him, that's where we got to get him, is in relation to his God. So those enemies, they make a plan that will bring Daniel's righteousness and his devotion to God into direct conflict with the laws of the king. You know, even when Daniel heard about the law to not pray, even when he heard about that law, he immediately then went and prayed. You know, there wasn't this conflict with Daniel as to whether he would or, you know, I'm not sure I'm ready to die for praying. But he immediately goes and opens up his windows and he begins to pray. And his enemies are so sure that they are there waiting to find him doing it. And when we look at King Darius, he made this law, or he allowed this law to be made because of his vanity. Kings love to have their egos stroked, to be told how great they are. I mean, even Daniel, even Daniel addresses King Darius with, "Oh, King, live forever." I mean, those are the kind of opening phrases that you gave to the king because he liked to be reminded of how great he was. Wouldn't it be awesome, King, if only you and no one else could be prayed to? Wouldn't that just be great? And King Darius let his pride, let his ego get the best of him, and he made a foolish decision based in his vanity. And then he found out what the real purpose of it was. But yet he was trapped. His vanity and his pride had put him in a position that he could not get out of. He could not stop the law that had been made. When a law was given, it had to be followed. It had to be carried out. It could not be rescinded even by the king. But he did everything that he could. And this shows how much Darius thought of Daniel. That here he is. I mean, number one, we already know he was already going to make him ruler over everything. But he also had so much love and care for Daniel that he put a lot of effort into trying to stop this. Once he realized what had happened, that he had been fooled, that he had been tricked into doing this, it says in verse 14 that as soon as the king heard this statement, he was deeply distressed and set his mind on delivering Daniel. And even until sunset, he kept exerting himself to rescue him. Kings did not put forth that kind of effort unless they really wanted something. So he immediately begins to put forth effort. He puts forth effort to the very last moment to try to find a way to get Daniel out of this. But at the end of it all, there are no legal solutions. He has to have Daniel put in the lion's den. Folks, this is the impact of a righteous man on an incredibly pagan king. Let's not delude ourselves here. Darius was no follower of God. And yet Daniel was such an exceptional follower of God that it demanded the respect of even someone who doesn't. And when we think about being light and when we think about being salt, that's the kind of life that we should be living. That even the people that have no understanding of the Bible, no care even for the Bible, that they at least respect us because of the people we are in righteousness. And that's exactly where we see Darius. Daniel was put into the lion's den, and the king did not sleep. So it's not some kind of feigned admiration. It is true admiration. He's truly worried about Daniel. And he went out first thing in the morning. In verses 19 through 22, it says, the king arose at dawn, at the break of day, and went in haste to the lion's den. And when he had come near to the den, he cried out with a troubled voice. The king spoke and said to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions? Daniel, servant of the living God. He runs out there, and that's how he addresses Daniel. Servant of the living God. This pagan king over the greatest nation on the earth at the time, he says that about Daniel. Has your God been able to deliver you? That's how he addresses it. He doesn't go out there and go, Daniel, you still alive? No, he says, what has your God done? Because clearly, he's heard about Daniel's God, most likely from Daniel. Listen to what it said. Daniel spoke to the king, O king, live forever. That's a standard greeting. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, inasmuch as I was found innocent before him, before God, and also towards you, O king, I have committed no crime. Daniel says, I did nothing wrong before my God, and he saved me. And I did nothing wrong, by the way, king, to you. I did nothing wrong to hurt you. I did nothing wrong against you and against your rule. You need to remember that. Well, those who plotted against the king and Daniel, you know, there might have been one thing that didn't take into account, right? That Daniel was the servant of the living God. And that God could deliver him, right? I don't think they took that into account when they did their little trick to get the king to sign a law that he couldn't take back. But that law's done. That law is finished. And it failed to accomplish its goal. And now the king has some authority within the law. And he takes the men that did that and all that they have, and he throws them into the lion's den. And the Bible tells us that the lions caught them before they even hit the ground. That's how hungry they were. They just spent the night in there with a man and couldn't eat him. But the minute they get a chance to eat somebody, they're catching them before they even hit the ground. Does anybody here feed your dog? You know what I'm talking about here? When you throw something out and they catch it in the air. That's almost what we can think of when we think of what took place when Darius said, now, you made a fool out of me, and now you're going to pay the price. Matthew chapter 5, verse 16 tells us to be a light, to let our light so shine that others may see our good works and glorify the Father which is in heaven. And that's exactly what Daniel did. Listen to Darius in verses 26 and 27. I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom, men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and enduring forever, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed, and his dominion will be forever. And he delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has also delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. Let your light so shine that others see your good works and glorify God. That's exactly what Darius does. He saw Daniel. He saw the kind of man he was. He saw the kind of way that he lived, how he governed, and he glorified God for it, and for the power that God demonstrated in that deliverance. Well, there are some lessons for us here. And the first is that with adversity comes opportunity. You know, Daniel had an opportunity. Yes, this was a very difficult situation that he found himself in, and yet it was an opportunity for him to demonstrate faith. It was an opportunity for him to shine his light. It was an opportunity for him to show who God is. God could never have demonstrated his ability to deliver Daniel if Daniel hadn't have been the kind of man worth delivering. And so he was that. He took that opportunity. Paul said in Philippians chapter 1 and verse 20, according to my earnest expectation and hope, that I will not be put to shame in anything, but with all boldness Christ will even now, as always, be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. Paul is writing the book of Philippians from a Roman prison, from a Roman. He's currently jailed in his house. He's under house arrest in Rome. And he writes that there, and he's waiting to find out if he's going to live or die. But Paul says, I see this as an opportunity, and I can promise you I'm going to take this opportunity and show what people need to see. That whether I live or whether I die, people will know God. And that's really how we need to view the adversity we sometimes face as a result of being Christians. Peter said in 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 19, for this finds favor if for the sake of conscience toward God a person bears up under sorrows when suffering unjustly. He also says that if you're suffering because of what you do, well, you really don't have anything to really brag about. But if you're suffering unjustly and you bear up under that and you continue to hold to your faith, you continue to be faithful, as Revelation puts it, as Jesus puts it in Revelation, be faithful to the point of death, then you take hold of an opportunity to show people God in very powerful ways. Second is that one never has to choose to do wrong. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13 says, no temptation has overtaken you, but such as is common to man. And God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will provide the way of escape also, so that you will be able to endure it. Folks, the way of escape from all temptations is to say no to them. Is there consequences to that? Yes. There always has been. And Jesus even talked about as much when He said that do not fear those that can kill your body, but fear the one that can kill your body and cast your soul into hell. In other words, fear the right things. Do not fear men, because all they can do is kill you. There in Matthew chapter 10 and verse 28. But God can do more. And so when you come to these decisions, when you have to make a decision like Daniel did, do I pray or do I die? Or do I pray and die, rather? Or do I not pray and be wrong before God? The decision was easy. Because Daniel feared God more than he feared the king of Persia or the lions in the den. And so he made that decision. There is no situation that we run into where we do not have a choice. We can always choose right. And it may cost us our lives, but at the end of all that, that's all they can do. And that is the gateway, ultimately, to glory. We also see from this story that serving God is not always easy. And I really haven't found a single page in the Bible that says that it is, or that it ever will be. In fact, on the night that Jesus died in John chapter 15, Jesus said, they're going to hate you. The world will hate you because it hated me. They'll hate you. They'll love their own. And if they love you, that means you're theirs. You're a part of them. But because you're of Jesus Christ, He says they're going to hate you. And we can understand what's going to come with the idea of hate there. Is that they're going to do everything that they can to destroy us. And so we should not enter into this thinking it's going to be easy. We should enter into it with our eyes open, understanding that it's difficult. I remember some 32 years ago after Jeannie and I were married, and I decided I was going to preach. Now, I grew up a preacher's kid. Fourth generation, so I've been around preachers all my life. I knew all that comes with the job, so to speak. Jeannie had only been a Christian for about a year and a half. And so she had no idea. But it was a decision we had to make together. And I didn't want her to go in with her eyes closed. I didn't want her to go in not making an informed decision. So I told her things. that it's not always easy, that it is at times an extremely difficult thing, and people that shouldn't act certain ways do act certain ways. And we went through all of that, and she made the decision for us to go ahead and go into the ministry, and I'm thankful for that. But we need to understand, we need to go in with our eyes open, we need to understand that people are not going to always accept us because of what we stand for. Because we stand in faith with Jesus Christ, in Jesus Christ and what He has taught. And that is going to come into conflict with the world, just as it did when He was upon this earth, and it will now. We need to understand that. And instead of being fearful of that, we need to build our lives to deal with that, to endure that, to, as the Bible says, persevere through that. That's really what the book of Revelation is about. It is about preparing the 7 churches of Asia to endure terrible persecution. And we ourselves need to always be preparing for a day in which we may be opposed in very vehement and personal and physical ways, rather. And last of all, we learn from the story of Daniel to not be ashamed of your faith. Daniel wasn't ashamed of who he was. He wasn't ashamed of his God. He wasn't ashamed that he prayed every day to Him. He wasn't ashamed that he lived for Him. And everybody knew it, including his enemies. Can that be said of us? And if not, why not? There is nothing that makes Daniel any more special than anyone here tonight, except for his devotion to God. And we can have that same devotion and live the same kind of life and have the same kind of impact on people that Daniel had in his life. Jesus said in Mark chapter 8 and verse 38, "For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will also be ashamed of him when He comes in the glory of His Father with His holy angels." There are so many issues in our society today that I'm afraid that so many Christians are ashamed of what Jesus Christ says about those things. And they might not agree with the people around them, but they wouldn't dare open their mouth. And if we ask ourselves why, it can come down to nothing except they are ashamed of the truth that they claim to follow. And if they're unwilling to let other people know that I stand here because that's where Jesus is. That's walking in the light where He is. So that we can have that fellowship, that closeness with Him. You know, Daniel was never ashamed of doing right. When he was 14 years old, he said, "I'm not eating that food." He made it very clear that he was going to do what was right. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, "We're not going to bow to your image." Even when Belshazzar was there in his throne room and the handwriting was on the wall and he promised Daniel all kinds of wealth if he'd tell him what it meant, Daniel said, "You keep your stuff. I don't want to have anything to do with it because you're an evil king who doesn't care about God." He was never ashamed. And when he read the law that you're not allowed to pray, he immediately went and prayed. Because it was who he was. There was no act when it came to Daniel. He was genuine. And that's what God calls for us to be today. Daniel shows us how to live faithful in a society that opposes God. I mean, he lived his entire life in one. Whether you want to go to his, before Babylonian captivity, to a nation that was so bad that God destroyed it, Judah. And then he's carried to Babylon, a pagan nation, where even today there is still they have the stones that Nebuchadnezzar put in the streets of Babylon that were proclaiming his love for his God. And Daniel was given pagan names, him and his 3 friends. We say Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but that's their pagan names. Those are names that praise pagan gods. It was Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah was their actual names. Names that praised God. And Daniel, his name was, while it doesn't continue to use his name throughout the book, his name was given Belteshazzar. So he went to a place of incredible opposition to God, and he lived a life that made a difference. And he converted a king in Nebuchadnezzar. And he had the respect of another in Darius. And we can do that too. If we live consistently faithful to God, no matter the consequence, no matter the situation, no matter the society, no matter the government, we are God's people. Then when people see us, they say our name and go, "You're the servant of God." Just as Darius did. Because that's how we're identified. That's the most important thing about us, is that we're the servant of God. If that's not you this evening, we hope and pray that you'll make the decision to make that something that characterizes you. If it is to simply live your life more faithful as a Christian, to take on those traits that Daniel demonstrates throughout the book, those traits of devotion to God and to His will. If you do that, you'll never go wrong, and you will be blessed, and so will the people that are around you. If we can help you get to that place in your life, won't you let us, as we stand and as we sing.